So right here we have two Stratocasters. On the right we have a made in Mexico standard Strat. On the left we have a made in the USA standard Strat. And I want to go over some of the differences with you. And I don't mean the differences that are on the spec sheet. I mean the real differences that differentiate the quality of the guitars. So basically these two guitars I've taken apart completely, one of them more than one time, and just from playing them and from setting up all different types of Stratocasters, these are some of the main things that I notice in myself. So if you see the bridge on the USA standard Strat, you'll notice that it has a 2-point floating tremolo, and we have a 6-point screw on the Mexican. That's something everybody knows. What people don't know is if I take my hand and I rub them against the saddles over here, on the American Strat, it's completely smooth. So if I play with my palm, there's no problem. Nothing is going to happen. On the Mexican Strat, if I do the same thing, I'll pretty much get cut up. And if I play with my palm touching the saddles at any time, I stand to get scraped up and cut. The same thing goes for these screws over here. On the Made in Mexico, they're much more rough. And I mean, these guitars have both seen the same amount of playing time and the same amount of adjustments likely. This one actually may have seen more adjustments, but it's still smoother. It's smoother. Now, everybody knows the pickups are obviously different. The electronics are different, but just in the feel of the selector switch, there isn't much of a difference. I mean, the USA one feels a little bit better, but they're both high quality selector switches. Now, as far as the necks are concerned of the guitars, the end of the frets are much smoother on this guitar. And being that I just got this one and I don't know the temperature that it was in, it feels okay for something like that. It's not perfect. The USA guitar comes with the rolled edges. So the end right here of the fretboard is rolled over. Over here you get a flat kind of 90-degree angle on this corner. So it makes it a little bit more comfortable to play. The necks are very similar. The necks are very similar in their size and the way that they feel. There's not that much of a difference in them. The tuners are both good quality tuners. The string tree on the USA Strat is an upgraded string tree. You get a rolling string tree here. And on the Made in Mexico, you get a string tree that's like that, which over time, that whole the tension of these springs pushing up, of the strings pushing up, will actually lift the screw, and that will loosen the hole. After a while, you may have to refill that hole and then drill a new hole for the screw. And I've had so many Strats that I know that even the ones that I've seen from the 90s and 80s, a lot of them have the original string tree. On the older Mexicans, you find that a lot of people have replaced the string tree, or that the string tree has broken off or something to that extent, re-drilled in another place. Now, from the perspective of someone who is more of a hobbyist than anything else, not a professional musician, and not, someone who works on guitars professionally, just someone who does it as a hobby and on their own time, I'll tell you that both guitars are nice guitars. They both play nice, they both sound nice. They're both guitars that allow you to set them up in the way that you want, unlike Gibson guitars and other guitars that have set necks that make working on the guitar and setting up the action perfectly as low as possible much more difficult. So the differences in quality of the craftsmanship is where this guitar is really noticeable. If you take off the pick guard, you'll notice the routing is much better on the USA Strat. I'm not going to take it off now, but you can look up pictures. When I opened this cavity, if any of you saw my video, it was covered in some kind of white powder material, which really looked to me like residue that's left over from some kind of polish or glaze or whatever they use in the factory, maybe rubbing compound. And that's sloppy work. That sits in there and that collects moisture and humidity, and it'll ruin the electronics of the guitar over time if it's not dealt with and cleaned out appropriately. You don't have that issue on the USA Strats. They take more care of the little things like that. The nuts are different. Here we have some kind of weird plastic that over time turns yellows for some reason. I've seen that happen on a lot of Strats. It turns like a brown color because just because plastic being left out, you know, and I don't know what kind of plastic they make it out of, but it's definitely plastic, and over time it's going to change color and look very awkward, and it's not going to hold up as well as this one. So both have adjustable truss rods from up here. The Mexican one is a lot harder to get into than the USA one. They use two completely different size wrenches. This one is 3/16 and this one is a little bit smaller. But when you go in here on the Mexican, you have to put the Allen key in a lot deeper. It's harder to turn the Mexican truss rod, and the Mexican truss rod also on the inside, even though this one was brand new and probably didn't ever have its truss rod adjusted for 10 years since it was new in the box, the quality of the thread in there just is not as good. It's very smooth on the USA Strat. You put the Allen key in, it fits in perfectly, it turns much smoother, and it feels much smoother. In terms of the tuners, I mean, they're both fine. They're both fine. And yes, some people prefer to put on locking tuners, but I don't. I just like to keep the tuners the way they are and the way they come from the factory for the most part. I don't like to change the tuners. It decreases the value of the guitar, and depending on what you decide to put in there, you may be never able to get it back to the point that it was originally. And yes, the tuners degrade over time because tuners are mechanical. So tuners have a, it's not like the wood. They have a lifespan. After a while, they just get either very stiff or very loose, or they just stop working and they need to be replaced. So I understand why people use the locking tuners, but you don't need to make that upgrade on either of these. The tuning keys are just as smooth on both guitars, especially once you can adjust the screw that's up here when they get loose. So on these type that come on both of them, and they both look pretty similar, you can utilize that and you won't really have as much of a problem, and you won't have a better experience on one than you would on the other. In terms of the bodies, they're very similarly shaped. As you can see, the dimensions are nearly identical. They both have pretty much the same exact weight. They're both made out of the same materials. Sometimes you can have a Mexican and an American Strat that originated from the same tree even. You never know. So in terms of the fretboard, you get a much darker fretboard on the USA Strat, and that's just like an aesthetics thing really, but the moisture that it contains is also important. So when you see darker ones, it's not always darker or lighter because of the color of the rosewood. Sometimes it's just because of the humidity or it fretboard oil or even dirt, things like that. But these are both clean guitars, and that's why I wanted to make the comparison between them. If we go in the back and we look at the trem blocks, they're both pretty much the same size. They're both just fine. The USA is made out of a different metal. It's, I believe, solid steel or copper infused, they call it. So it's copper and steel. On the Mexican, you're not exactly sure exactly what's in that block. It's a different alloy. Remember that the USA parts are all made in the USA. The Mexican made parts are not made in the USA, so they're made in two different factories, which means that the metal they use can come from two different sources. Other than that, you would be happy with either one of these guitars. And if you were blindfolded, aside from the bridge and the rolled edges on the American Strat, you likely would not be able to tell a difference because they both have the same exact weight. And whether you could tell the difference tonally is up for debate, because I would argue that the amplifier has a lot more to do with, you know, the sound that you're getting than the differences in these guitars. Yes, the Mexican one will be brighter because these Fat 50s will give you a more mellow sound than you would get out of the really, really bright ceramic pickups that you have in the Mexican guitar. But the majority of people wouldn't notice, and especially people who aren't musicians wouldn't notice. So the pots are better on the USA Strat. They just feel a little bit smoother. Like I said, the switch on the USA Strat is superior, but the Mexican one is still fine. It works well and it feels well. It doesn't feel like one of the cheap Squires where you feel like that thing is gonna break. There aren't really that much more differences between these two guitars. I mean, you've just seen everything that I can think of. You know, the springs and the plate that will screw the springs into the wood of the body, those are, you know, pretty much identical also. You're not going to see a difference between, you know, the alloy that's in this Mexican one and the American one, because if the alloy in the Mexican one is strong enough to hold up, then, you know, it goes without saying that the one in the USA will. But they both will hold up, that's the point. And those are the differences, really. There's not really much else to say. So you've seen it here.